Welcome to Stephanomics, and today we're bringing the world of 2023 to you. It's our traditional, strangely popular look ahead to the big themes and questions coming down the track over the next 12 months, with a carefully selected panel of wise men and women who've been kind enough to make Stephanomics part of their holiday season. So in the US, we have our Washington bureau chief at Bloomberg, Peggy Collins, and Bloomberg's chief economist and frequent participant on this show, Tom Orlik. Here in London, we have the glittering star of Bloomberg television, Francine Lacqua, and a newcomer to Stephanomics who is not new to the European corridors of power. His views are taken extremely seriously by senior policymakers across Europe and beyond. Charles Grant, director and founder of the award-winning think tank, the Centre for European Reform. Welcome to all of you, and thank you very much for doing this, especially people who are doing it for the second time, because you know what you're in for. We are all about looking ahead on this programme, not looking back. But I think it makes sense just very briefly to ask you all what your most memorable moment of 2022 was. Peggy.
You know, Stephanie, one of the most memorable moments of 2022 that I think will reverberate in 2023 actually came in July when, surprisingly, after a lot of resistance, Senator Manchin did a U-turn and struck a deal that was a surprise in Washington, which is pretty hard to do, with Senator Chuck Schumer. And they passed what is known now as the Inflation Reduction Act. But it was actually a turnaround in the sense that a lot of people had thought that the Biden administration would not be able to get that comprehensive climate, energy tech bill through before the midterm elections came up. So I think that was one of the surprises for us in the newsroom of 2022.
And we're going to get into some of that, the changing politics in the US in a minute. Tom Orlik, what was your big surprise?
So there were so many huge surprises in 2022, Stephanie, and I'm sure the other wise people on the panel are gonna hit the big ones. A kind of a smaller, quieter surprise which stuck with me was a moment in June when Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen put her hand in the air and admitted that she'd been wrong on inflation. In 2021, Yellen, in common with the vast majority of the economics profession, had dismissed inflation as a transitory phenomenon, nothing we needed to be really worried about. Of course, that proved to be 180 degrees wrong. Inflation was a very serious problem. Central banks had to respond with the most aggressive tightening since we've seen since the 1980s. And as we look ahead into 2023 and recall that not many people anticipated the coronavirus, not many people anticipated Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Perhaps Charles will tell me that's wrong. Not many people anticipated inflation. I think it's useful to remember that if Janet Yellen can get it wrong on something as big and important as that, we can all get it wrong as well.
Oh, and we have Charles Grant. What stuck out for you in 2022?
The thing that sticks in my memory from 2022 was Olaf Scholz's speech to the Bundestag, the so-called Zeitenwende speech. It was 2 or 3 days after the Russian invasion. He basically rejected many of the principles of Merkel's foreign policy. So because they're going to be much tougher on Russia, they're going to free themselves from dependency on Russian energy supplies, and we're going to spend 2% of GDP on defence. And meanwhile, 100 billion euros are going to a special fund so that German armed forces could catch up with those of their peers. And this was a revolution in German foreign and security policy. Subsequently, one can be a bit frustrated with the slow pace of implementation. One can be a bit annoyed that the revolution didn't extend to China policy, where Germany still seems stuck on the old economic model of using China as a very important export market and almost dependent on China. Nevertheless, it was a revolution in German foreign policy, and I think that sticks in my memory.
Francine Lacqua.
I mean, first of all, time stretches. I feel like the last 12 months were a decade all in one, partly because we weren't used to traveling anymore, but also the news cycle has just been absolutely relentless. So the most memorable moment for me has to be the lettuce, right? The Liz Truss lettuce, which brought us like equal, it made us laugh, but it also made us cry at the same time. What a week of absolute mayhem in the UK that was. I was in Rome covering the Italian elections, Stephanie, and they had to call me back in London because the markets in the UK was so crazy. I've been covering news for 20 years. They've never pulled me out of an Italian story to cover a UK one because it was crazier. And, we had the Jubilee celebrations, we had Boris Johnson resigning, we had the Queen dying, her funeral, the market meltdown, and then Liz Truss resigning. So it was quite a year for the UK.
And the sheer absurdity being symbolised by this iceberg lettuce, which was judged to be more likely to last the month than Liz Truss, and so it proved. Thanks to everyone for that. I look back at my look ahead column, which I'm writing again this year for Business Week. I started with what I suspect was not a very bold prediction at the time, that coronavirus was not going to be enemy number one for the global economy. The biggest dangers were going to stem from inflation and the risk that policymakers called the post-COVID recovery wrong. I mean, Tom, even as I wrote that, central banks were scrambling to reassess how long inflation was going to stick around, what kind of policy action it might require to put it back in its box. I mean, we have now had almost a year, maybe 9 months of record-breaking monetary tightening around the world. Many central banks going up in 0.75 percentage point increases for the first time. Are we there yet, or will 2023 bring more of the same?
So the story of 2022 was the story of how far and how fast inflation rose and what central banks had to do to respond. The story of 2023 is going to be the story of how far and how fast inflation recedes. So our view is that we're going to see a pretty rapid drop from the extremely elevated levels that we've seen in the back end of 2022. We're not going to see inflation sticking around at 7, 8, 9, 10% for very long. Even so, especially in the United States, where wage gains are pretty astronomical, we're going to see inflation sticky at an uncomfortably high level for the Fed, the European Central Bank, the Bank of England, and others. What that means, we think, is that the pace of rate hikes is going to slow and then stop, but we're not quite there yet in terms of central bank tightening. Couple of other wildcards to throw in there in terms of global monetary policy. The first one is Turkey. Now, Turkey, of course, has been marching to its own drummer on monetary policy, cutting interest rates despite inflation running at 85%. And that's very much been a political decision driven by President Erdogan. Now, there's an election coming up in Turkey in June. The view from our Turkey economist, who, by the way, joined us from the central bank over there, is that the current policy settings just aren't sustainable. And after that general election, after that presidential election, no matter who wins, we're going to have to see a significant shift with a big rate hike to stave off a currency and financial crisis. The other wildcard, of course, is Japan, where Haruhiko Kuroda, the architect of extreme easing, is now poised to step back from the front lines of policy making, retiring in the first half of 2023. That's going to be an opportunity for a reset there as well.
And of course, apart from the modest but significant change at the end of this year, that's the one central bank that has just not moved as the world has moved around them. Tom, there's much talk about whether or not we will dodge a recession in the US or indeed globally. What's your take?
So it's funny, I think a lot of people look at the strength in the US labor market right now, the strength of wage gains, the very low unemployment, and say, you know what, all of this talk about recession we had over the last few months, it must have been overdone. The economy is still looking pretty healthy. I think you actually need to flip it round and look at it in the other direction. It's the fact that the labor market remains very hot, with unemployment low and wages rising quickly, which means the Fed's job is still far from done. And it's the fact that the Fed has to carry on layering on rate hikes, which means that a recession, we think, in the back end of 2023 remains more likely than not. Could they dodge that? Yeah, they could dodge it. Inflation could disappear more quickly than we expect. The Fed could get away with less rate hikes than we expect. Other unexpected stuff could happen. But if you look at the history books, there aren't many examples of this pace of monetary tightening occurring without a downturn following a few months later.
And of course, if you're the rest of the world, which we'll get onto in a minute, that is the fact that the US is looking relatively strong now is actually in some sense bad news, because it does mean, as you've suggested, that there will be further interest rate rises that in a sense the rest of the world may not need. Peggy, just staying in the US for a minute, I mean, if we had spoken 6 months ago, or even just before the US midterm congressional elections in early November, we would have expected inflation and the economy to dominate the result of those. But it didn't work out like that, did it?
Well, it's interesting, Stephanie, because it did in some ways. The economy was certainly a priority on voters' minds, but it turned out that the job market that Tom was just talking about, the strength of that, the fact that most Americans had a job, or if they were looking for a job, they could find one, seemed to put them in a better state when they went to the ballot box, and that some of the social and cultural issues that were really bubbling up with the Roe v. Wade decision and other things seemed to be one of the most important things for voters when they ultimately press the button. So the economy was certainly there. But as Tom is saying, if next year in 2023, we do actually see some of the Fed's jacking up of interest rates actually hurting people when it comes to whether or not they can hold on to their job or get another job, then you might see voters have more of a reaction at the ballot box against the Biden administration, if that makes sense, Stephanie.
Yeah, and of course there was a time when we thought we were going to have a sweep across the board for the Republicans, which often, of course, happens in midterm elections against the incumbent president. We ended up with a more mixed picture, but we do have a different Congress coming back in January. How is that going to feed through to policy and what Congress does?
Well, it certainly will make a difference. As you said, Stephanie, Democrats did better than many people were expecting, both on the federal level and in many of the governor's races across the country. But it will still mean that Republicans have the House coming into 2023. That may mean a couple of things, that the White House may have to turn to more executive orders to get things done, and also that they will get fewer things done through Congress. I do think there's some issues that they might still be able to find some common ground on, but we may see, as I mentioned, some more executive orders ruling the day when the Biden administration really wants to get something done.
And very briefly, I'm going to put you on the spot. I mean, of course, we've got a countdown now. Now we've got through the midterms. Of course, we're going to have a gradual crescendo up to the presidential elections in 2024. Is Trump going to be on the ballot? If you had to guess right now, will he be the nominee?
He says he's going to be on the ballot. So I think we have to position ourselves and expect that he will be. Certainly candidates like Ron DeSantis, who hasn't declared a candidacy for the 2024 race, but a lot of people expect him to. We expect others will certainly surface in the Republican Party. But Trump is still, in many people's minds, the biggest threat to Biden winning a second term. If he declares, we're also waiting for that decision to come in early January. So to answer you directly, Stephanie, because Trump has said he will run, I think we expect him to, but a lot can happen in 2 years. Okay,
we're going to cross the Atlantic now. And Charles Grant, Tom mentioned, I mean, we've had many things kind of overturn our predictions in this session. Last year, it would have been Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which the Russian experts at Centre for European Reform had definitely put on the radar, but not everyone was predicting. What surprised you about the way Russia's invasion of Ukraine has played out, and where do you see it going in 2023?
Two things surprised me, Stephanie. I'll say more about the second. The first one, I think everybody was surprised by the Ukrainians' ability to resist the invasion and by the sheer incompetence of the Russian military leaders. Having said that, the war is not over. Ukraine has not won, and most of the military experts I talked to think we're going to face a stalemate of several years, with neither side probably able to greatly push back the other side to a huge degree. So I think the war is going to go on, which leads to my second thing that surprised me, was the degree of Western unity. Really surprising, given how badly the transatlantic relationship was at the time that Biden pulled out of Afghanistan, given the arguments within the European Union on how to handle Russia. The fact is the Europeans have been more or less united, with the possible exception of Hungary. And the US and the EU have worked pretty well together on most issues most of the time. Having said that, the caveat is, of course, will the unity hold looking forward? I think if we face a stagflation in the coming years and people see that it's caused by the war in Ukraine leading to very high energy prices and inflation and a lower standard of living, then the public opinion may be whipped up by populists to oppose the war. It's not really happening to a very great deal at the moment, but perhaps more worrying is just the difference of analysis between two groups of governments in the EU. You have the Baltic countries and Poland, and to some degree the Nordics and Romania and the Czech Republic, who would want to be very tough on Russia. They don't want to talk to Putin. They say regime change in Russia, the war must go on until Ukraine has reconquered all its territory and isolate Russia. When then you have the French and the Italians and the Germans, and indeed President Biden is in the same group, saying actually don't humiliate Russia. We're going to have to deal with Russia in the long run. At some point there will have to be a negotiation, and we have to find a way of working out a relationship with Russia in the long term, which sort of implies that at a certain point they'll put pressure on Ukraine to compromise some of its territory in return for peace. Though nobody's actually saying that at the moment. That is implicit, I think, in the French, German, Italian and American position. So there is this tension between the two schools of thought in the European Union, with the British somewhere in the middle, but perhaps on a bit at the tougher end of the spectrum. And the longer the war goes on, the more these tensions will grow, and the harder it will be to keep the West united.
And you mentioned at the start that very striking speech that Chancellor Olaf Scholz gave, but you also mentioned that it had been a bit disappointing when it comes to the follow-up on that. I mean, when you're someone who's been quite frustrated over the years sometimes that the Europeans were not more muscular in their approach to defence, is this going to fundamentally change the way Europe sees itself geopolitically? Is it going to change its commitment to defence in a lasting way?
I think the war has been good for European defence, both the sort of manifestations of European defence. One is NATO, which includes the Americans. One is the EU, which doesn't include the Americans. They both actually moved forward. NATO has clearly been a very, very important organisation protecting European countries from the Russian threat. And although NATO has made a point of not being directly involved in the war, of course, and staying out of it, it is behind the scenes strengthening its eastern flank, sending more troops to its eastern member states to protect them. So that's good for NATO, but also the EU itself. Outside the spotlight, behind the scenes, the EU is doing a lot on defence. It's got something called the European Peace Facility, which is funding the purchase of arms for Ukraine. It's never done that before, and it's spent most of that. The first 7 or 8 billion euros has been spent on Ukraine already. They're replenishing it with another top-up of a similar amount. There's a European Defence Fund, which is being spent on European industries. The EU's played a huge role in pushing through sanctions against Russia because of Ukraine.
It sounds funny to say it's been good for European defence, I guess, in the same way that World War II was good for Europe's sense of its need for defence.
Yes, it's worth actually saying just one number, because Bloomberg likes numbers. European defence budgets have gone up about 200 billion euros this year, which is a huge amount. Half of that is the German budget, going up by 100 billion euros, the extra 100 billion for the Germans. So Europe's are actually putting their money where their mouth is when it comes to defence for the first time ever, really, in many years.
And when I was in Japan not long ago, that was the week that the Prime Minister announced a big increase in defence spending there. So the world has been shaken up. Francine, you've been very patient. As you mentioned, you were often gadding around Europe for Bloomberg Television and interviewing some of the great and good. I mean, it has not been great for Europe this winter, and we are probably looking at a recession thanks to high energy prices. But what you might have called the real downside scenarios for Europe that we might have had a few months ago as a result of the Ukraine war, they haven't materialized. Is the hard part still to come?
Well, I think it could get harder from here, Stephanie, partly because of the fairly mild winter, I guess, that we had in the Eurozone and in the UK in October and November. So oddly, and I have checked this with the newsroom because I couldn't quite believe what I was reading, Europe is ending one of the toughest years for energy in a stronger position than it started the year. And this is partly because of the high energy prices attracting cargoes, for example, of LNG, liquefied natural gas, over the autumn, which then continue to be discharged. So you're right, we've had a pretty difficult year, inflation climbing to the highest in decades, household bills increasing multifold, but a lot and everything probably will depend on energy. It's a bit counterintuitive that our storage sites are now at the brim, so we do have quite a few months of being able to cope. December, that freeze, and we're still in it. Energy prices soaring. So I guess it's whether we have power shortages whether the situation in Europe will get much worse. There are other major risks. For example, that gas price cap from the EU, which is seen as a positive, could also send some of the cargoes elsewhere. So, as you know, watch out for energy prices, which could get a lot higher. And if that touches employment, then I guess all bets are off.
And I mean, you spend a lot of time in Italy. It's usually safe to put decent odds on an Italian crisis when the cost of money is going up, and obviously the European Central Bank is raising interest rates. But the new government has been quite timid so far. The government that came in as a new populist government. So is it possible that Italy's going to miss that great moment of reckoning in 2023?
They've kind of been on best behavior, haven't they? Now, I don't think it'll be smooth sailing, but I do think the trend will be Italy trying to stick to the reforms that Mario Draghi had promised in exchange for money. There has been huge opposition, and this is something sometimes that's missed if you're not in Italy. There's been huge opposition to the ECB and to Christine Lagarde. But Giorgia Meloni has scrapped one of the controversial measures aimed at promoting cash payments, and that was to please the European Union. And for the moment, she's also stuck to her, staunch support for Ukraine following the Russian invasion, which to some could be seen as a surprise. So she's been more vocal in questioning the EU stance on immigration and energy, but actually so far it looks like, plain sailing for now, Stephanie.
Famous laugh, plain sailing. Can we ever use that phrase for Italy? Charles, do you share Francine's view? And is there anywhere else that we should be looking for potential trouble in 2023? Or not trouble, for that matter?
I'm slightly more worried than Francine. I mean, Meloni is a close friend of Mr. Kaczynski, who runs Poland, and Mr. Orban, who runs Hungary, and they are embarked on a sort of permanent warfare against the EU over so-called rule of law issues, the EU being upset that they denied damaged the independence of their judiciaries and so on. So I think Meloni has, as Francine says, been in very good behaviour so far, but I'm not sure it's going to last. I think the pressures on her from her base to throw a few stones at the glass houses of Brussels may rise. But that's one thing I'm looking out for. Another thing, as I said, is there going to be a resolution of this endless argument between Poland and Hungary on the one hand and the EU on the other over the rule of law? I'm not very optimistic. Two final questions I'd pose are, is the EU going to become more protectionist, more focused on industrial policy, more focused on securing supply chains, which has been the tendency of recent years, and suspending rules on state aid so it can build up huge hydrogen industries, battery industries, and so on, and microchip industries? So I think the EU under French leadership is becoming far more protectionist than it used to be. Is that going to persist? And finally, and we'll come back to this later, I guess, Stephanie, will there be a rapprochement between the UK and the EU?
That is an interesting question. Well, we may part the UK briefly because people will feel they've had an excess of Europe already. But Tom, one thing that we've mentioned briefly on this programme before that's helped Europe have those overflowing gas supplies that Francine talked about was the slowdown in China because it made more energy available for Europe to snap up. And a part was partly because the Chinese authorities have continued to put control of COVID ahead of economic growth. And we had sort of expected that to continue for a large part of 2023, only a gradual move away from the COVID zero policies. But everything seemed to change very quickly in the last few weeks of the year. I guess I'm interested, you spent 11 years in Beijing. How do you read what happened to COVID policies in China and how that affects the outlook for next year?
So before getting on to China, Stephanie, I just wanted to pick up on one comment from Charles. Just from a British negotiating position, I suggest we hold back on using French words like rapprochement ahead of concessions from across the channel. So on China, now I gave Beijing a lot of credit for the way they managed COVID. Yes, COVID zero placed enormous strain on the economy, an enormous strain on society, and we saw that social strain bubbling up in those extraordinary protests in the last few weeks. But COVID zero saved a lot of lives. Until a few weeks ago, just a few thousand people dead from COVID in China compared to vastly larger numbers for much smaller populations in other parts of the world. So I gave them a lot of credit. The last few weeks have sort of really shaken my confidence that they've got a plan for an exit. Now, there is a way out of COVID zero whilst minimizing public health costs, and that requires a gradual approach, to allow time for vaccines to go into arms and for health facilities to be moved into place. Clearly, that is not the approach which China has taken. Reopening has happened really, really quickly. And I'm not an epidemiologist. I don't know how things are going to play out in the next few weeks and months. But the experience in other countries around the world, and what I read from people who are experts in the way diseases spread through populations, suggests there's a risk of a really serious public health catastrophe in China in the start of 2023. So that's really important. Hasn't happened yet. We don't know how Chinese society, how China's policymakers are going to react to it. And that means there's still a huge amount of uncertainty as we look into China in the year ahead. That said, from an economic perspective, the rapid exit from COVID-0 is pretty clearly a positive for China's growth numbers looking forward. Yes, right now, people are pretty cautious. They don't want to get infected in this first wave. They're staying at home. We're going to see some pretty brutal growth numbers from China in the fourth quarter of 2022 and perhaps right at the start of 2023. But by the time we get through the winter and into the second quarter of 2023, I think we're going to start looking at some pretty strong growth numbers out of China. Our base case for the year ahead is that we get 5.1% growth. That base case assumed a gradual reopening. We've now got a more rapid reopening, so I think risks to that 5.1% number are now to the upside. For the rest of the world, of course, there's a positive there. China's going to be buying more stuff, but there's also a negative. Because China's going to be buying more stuff, the prices of stuff are going to start going up, and we'll look especially at prices for commodities like energy and think about how they're going to be playing into the inflation story in the US, in Europe, and elsewhere.
Yeah, so if we do have good economic news in China, that will be making the job of central banks everywhere harder and increasing, as you say, the sort of stickiness of inflation. I mean, Charles, obviously the shifting relations with China is the stuff of years, not months. But we do seem to be in a new era of geoeconomics. And actually, I spoke about it at length in the last week's episode with Sir Paul Tucker. You know, economic tools increasingly being used for geopolitical objectives. Is Europe inevitably going to be pulled into this, what we would call the new Cold War? Or do you think there's a desire to really resist this weaponization of the global economy?
I think Europe is going to be pulled into a new Cold War, but rather reluctantly dragging its feet. I mean, Europe's in a very difficult place when it comes to the growing conflict between China and the US, because economically it depends more on China than the US does. A greater percentage of its trade is with China. It also has a very different sort of geopolitical attitude to China. Europeans worry about Chinese behaviour, the abuse of human rights, the threats to its neighbours, the theft of intellectual property and so on. But I think many people in Washington worry about Chinese power per se. And I think many people in Washington, even if China started behaving better, would still see China as a threat to America's role in Asian security. Biden, to his credit, has made an effort to reach out to the Europeans and consult them on what he does on China. But I think that the tensions will grow because the Europeans just don't want to be as tough as the Americans. However, the more we get into a sort of new Cold War, the more inevitably the Europeans, however reluctantly, are forced to take sides and will take sides on the American side, as far as I can see.
And Peggy, I mean, we talked about the new Congress. The one thing that there is bipartisan agreement on is that the US should continue to be playing tough with China. Do you sense from the administration an appetite for opening up more sort of wars along the lines of the chip wars and more weaponization of trade wars from the US?
I do think there's appetite there, Stephanie. I think the Biden administration has tried to position itself very tough on China. Particularly, we saw in 2022 President Biden himself be very forthright about his feelings about Taiwan, for example. And we've seen Secretary of State Blinken this fall say that the U.S. sees the timetable for China potentially invading Taiwan moving up. So I do think there's quite a hawkish viewpoint from the Biden administration towards China while they are still trying to keep a dialogue open. And the Republicans certainly are coming out of the gate in 2023 with control of the House in a similar position that they want to look strong on China. So I do think you'll continue to see legislators try and policymakers try to show that they're being tough on China while keeping the door open between the two countries because we are still so interconnected. I think that's one thing to watch, certainly. And then the other is the CHIPS bill that you mentioned. That is really just starting to get off the ground, passed in 2022, but a lot of money and energy is going into trying to onshore or nearshore the making of semiconductor chips, those all-important semiconductor chips. So I do think the Biden administration is hoping that some of that will actually get off the ground in 2023 and potentially offset some of the job losses that we may see from the Fed ratcheting up the interest rate. So they are hoping that as the Fed tries to strike this soft landing that Tom talked about before, that there will be some new jobs coming into the economy from the infrastructure bill that they passed in their first couple of years, and then from this semiconductor bill that passed as well in 2022.
Although it's funny because one of our colleagues, Sean Donnan, has been going down to where one of the new semiconductor factories is going to be, and they're struggling to find construction workers. So the issue of tight labour markets is returning to bite them. This is the time of year, Peggy, where you as bureau chief are sort of thinking about reallocating people as we see kind of the political mood shifting and activity moving to different areas. And I was struck by you mentioning antitrust, sort of for competition moves being an area that you saw being a little more active next year. Is that one of the areas where President Biden can continue to make news and do things even with a divided Congress?
Yes, I do think so. I do think there is some appetite in Congress on both sides of the aisle on this issue of antitrust, and particularly related to the consolidation of power amongst the big tech companies. But even without that, the Biden administration has two key allies and potential forces behind it. One is Lina Khan, heading up the FTC, and then also at the Justice Department, there's Assistant Attorney General Jonathan Cantor. Both of them are very aggressive on this anti-tech issue, and they see it as kind of the new frontier for helping consumers and workers, that this consolidation of industries and business has really, at many junctures, hurt workers, especially given that fewer and fewer of them are protected by unions. And so I do think there's a three-pronged effort between the Biden administration's push on the Hill, as well as Lina Khan and Jonathan Cantor's pushes on antitrust, where you could see more moves or cases coming down that could change the landscape.
Okay, so I feel like since at least some of us are sitting in the UK, we probably have to linger a little bit on the sad, sorry state of the UK economy and politics. Francine, you started with the lettuce. I was struck by a poll I just saw of just under half of the UK population is thinking we might get yet another prime minister in 2023, despite the fact there's no election on the horizon, and the government, in theory, has quite a big majority. There are strikes up and down the country as we speak, including an unprecedented nurses' strike, ambulance workers. Can it only get better from here, or do you think actually things are going to get worse first?
Well, I thought, Stephanie, that things could only get better, mainly because I'm an optimist. And I spoke to John Stepek, of course, from Bloomberg Wells, and he thoroughly depressed me on house prices and, frankly, everything else. So he argues that house prices could fall over 30%. Now, 30% house price fall, that's a crash. I mean, that's a lot. So, frankly, everything depends, as you know now, on the labor market, whether that stays strong. I think the lesson from history is that when a recession hits, unemployment takes about a quarter or so to respond. Once it does, it tends to rise rapidly. So it depends really on the rise and whether the Bank of England can manage it, whether we get through this. The Bank of England officials that we speak to, and you know them better than me, Stephanie, they worry, or they think there's a gradual rise in jobless rate next year. The big risk is that if there's a huge increase all of a sudden, if it's a lot more rapid than we think, then I guess all bets are off.
I noticed that our chief Europe economist had done a few sort of back of the envelope calculations that just in terms of where incomes were now and where the affordability of mortgages relative to a year or two ago, house prices look about 20% overvalued in the UK. So it does feel like they're heading for a fall one way or another. Charles, that whole mini budget fiasco in the autumn, the optimistic take on that was it meant the death of cakeism in the UK. It meant the death of this idea that was associated particularly with Boris Johnson, that you could dodge tough choices, have your cake and eat it. Is that a sort of positive spin on what's happened, that now Britain's going to get serious, is going to be forced to go on a better path because it's tried all the other ones?
I think cakeism has been defeated, and the establishment and the grown-ups are in control of the levers on the British economy now, for now. But let's not forget that the Tory party has many members of Parliament in it who are cakeists, who, like Boris Johnson and Liz Truss, sort of believe you can have tax cuts and spending increases and growth all at the same time without worrying too much about the consequences. Some of them are still in that school, and they are particularly the ones who really hate the European Union. So they may prevent Rishi Sunak from, if I may use a French word, Tom, engineering a rapprochement with the European Union over the coming months, which it's all about the Northern Ireland Protocol. It's far too boring to explain, but essentially the British government has to compromise on this protocol and agree to allow some checks on goods passing between Great Britain and Northern Ireland to preserve the fact that there isn't a barrier between the north of Ireland and the south of Ireland, because Northern Ireland's in the single market. That's what it's about. The British government is reluctant to do so. It will have to do so. Rishi Sunak is strong enough, if he wishes, to see down his own right-wing Brexiteers and the DUP, the leading unionist party in Northern Ireland, if he wishes to. But I'm not sure he's tough enough to do so. And if he doesn't do so, then President Biden won't come to Northern Ireland for the 25th anniversary of the Good Friday Agreement in April, and the Americans will be quite annoyed, and he won't get a better relationship with the European Union, which is really bad in very many respects at the moment. So he does have to take on the cakeists, take on the extremists, take on the Brexiteers and defeat them. I hope he does, but I'm not sure that he's going to be able to do so.
And probably the single most effective thing you could do to support the economy is to have a stronger trade relationship with the EU. But as you suggest, it's politically extremely difficult to handle.
Well, I think when we're heading probably for a Labour government in a couple of years' time, that even a Labour government, which will want a stronger relationship with the EU, a close relationship, will not reverse the essentials of the Brexit deal, namely out of the single market, out of the customs union, no freedom of movement. So even a better relationship will still lead to a lot of economic damage. And as you may have noticed, Stephanie, the Centre for European Reform just published a report today on how much Brexit has damaged the British economy. We've constructed a doppelganger model of an economy similar to the British economy, which didn't undergo Brexit. And the gap between the growth of the doppelganger economy and the British economy is about 5.5%. That's led to the income for the Treasury being cut by about £40 billion a year, which is roughly the same as the tax increases Rishi Sunak recently announced. So the cost to the British economy and to the exchequer of Brexit is quite large and is going to remain, sadly.
Tom, it has been a tough year in Europe. The US still potentially looking at a recession, and China. But it should be said, there's a lot of the rest of the world that has not necessarily been as hard hit. I mean, I notice India's growth is now going to outpace China's for at least a couple of years in a row. And of course, the Gulf is booming thanks to high energy prices. We're looking, as a global economist does, at the entire world economy. Who are the relative winners from the shocks of 2022? Who's coming out of this better?
First of all, Stephanie, let me say that I was poised to forgive Charles for the repeat appearance of rapprochement, but then he had to follow up with doppelganger, which is a different country, but the same wrong side of the linguistic divide. So look, I think until quite recently, we could tell a story about a global economy which was supported by three pillars: really low borrowing costs, reliably supercharged demand from China, and ever-increasing tech trade and financing ties. And what's happened in the last few years is all of those pillars have been kicked away. Borrowing costs have gone to the roof. China, as we've just discussed, has gone from being a reliable growth driver to a real wild card for the global economy next year. And of course, fractured US-China ties and even more Russia's invasion of Ukraine have really replaced kind of optimistic hopes for globalization with a new reality of kind of tariffs and embargoes and sanctions and geopolitical statecraft. So for the global economy writ large, all of these things are negative, right? Growth is going to be weaker, inflation is going to be higher. But as you mentioned, Stephanie, there is also, at a kind of micro level, going to be a pattern of winners and losers. right? And if we think about some of the potential winners in this new and more chaotic and more disorderly and more fragmented world, I think we can point to companies and countries that control access to crucial resources, right? So if you're controlling access to a crucial piece of the semiconductor supply chain, or if you're pumping a lot of the petrochemicals which the world relies on, potentially the new world looks better for you, more opportunities than the old world. If you're a country that could potentially step into supply chains and give countries and companies a bit of a hedge against their China exposure, if you're a Mexico or a Vietnam or an India, Stephanie, you mentioned India now outpacing China, then this shift to a more broken, more fragmented world could also mean significant opportunities as well as new risks. So I think we tend to think about emerging markets as a pack, right? And certainly investors often treat them as a kind of a pack and don't differentiate in between them. The reality, though, of course, is that within the emerging market universe, you've got lots of different qualities of institutions. So you've got Brazil's central bank, for example, which hikes aggressively to get inflation under control. And you've got Turkey's central bank, which is dominated by politics and which bizarrely cuts interest rates and gives a further leg to already supercharged inflation. You've got emerging markets that are massive commodity exporters, like many of the emerging markets in the Middle East, and which are kind of just counting the money flow into their treasuries as Russia's invasion of Ukraine drives global energy prices through the roof. And then you've got lots of other emerging and frontier economies, like Sri Lanka, for example, which defaulted on its debt last year because it couldn't afford to pay for food and pay for energy imports and repay its lenders at the same time. So I think this sort of more fragmented world, the world of higher borrowing costs, the world of broken supply chains, I think it's going to reinforce the sort of the need to differentiate within the emerging market universe. Who's got what technologies, who's got what commodities, who's got good institutions, who's got bad institutions. These are going to be some of the important questions going forward.
Okay, so I think we have had our tour of the world. Very briefly, before you escape, traditionally I now ask for everyone's wild cards, things to watch, unexpected things to look out for in 2023. Francine.
So the one thing I'm watching out for, Stephanie, is probably that you could get potentially better data. I don't know whether Tom and you think that we could get inflation, suddenly disappearing quicker than expected. But if that helps the market, then we're in very different economy in 2023 with households, willing to spend and everything looking much rosier. I'm not sure about my own conviction, but that's what I'm watching out for.
Charles Grant.
I think my sort of wild card would be actually an unexpected rapprochement in the relationship between China and the West. It's been getting worse and worse for 10 years because of Chinese behaviour has been unacceptable to the West. It's been bullying its neighbours, stealing intellectual property, abusing human rights and so on. But actually, although, as Tom said, the economy is probably going to pick up in China, they've got a lot of internal problems. There was unrest we haven't talked about of demonstrations all across China, which forced Xi Jinping to abandon his zero COVID policy, which is quite a thing. They're tied geopolitically to Russia, which has turned out to be rather a dodgy and unsuccessful ally. And the West is very united. And I think that the Russian war has made the Chinese scared of invading Taiwan because they can see the West would back Taiwan, probably. So I think I would predict that the Chinese leadership will be so focused on sorting out domestic problems, they'll actually be a bit nicer to the West and look for some rapprochement.
Interesting. Peggy, what's your wild card?
So, Stephanie, in the U.S., I think the wild card to watch would be the debate over the debt ceiling or debt limit. We are expected to hit that sometime in 2023, and I think the Republicans are really going to come to the bargaining table to talk about the entitlement programs for the first time in several years. Entitlement programs meaning Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, some changes potentially there to cut costs. And I do think that's one area where Congress likes to go up to the deadline like journalists do, and that could cause some real rattling in markets, not only in the U.S., around the world.
Thanks, Peggy. And Tom Orlik. Your wild card.
So after a number of years which have been marked by plague, by war, by talk of recession, it's really easy to focus on what could go wrong. And our base case for the global economy next year is pretty gloomy. We're forecasting 2.4% global growth in 2023. And if you leave aside the COVID crisis year of 2020 and the global financial crisis year of 2009, 2.4% growth is actually the lowest going all the way back to 1993. So pretty gloomy baseline projection. I think it's also important to keep in mind, though, coming back to sort of Janet Yellen's acknowledgement of forecasting failure, that we could just be wrong, right? And this time we could end up being too pessimistic. If US inflation disappears more quickly than we expect, if Europe has a warmer winter, more gas, and so less of a problem with inflation than we expect, if China manages to exit from COVID zero a bit more smoothly than we expect, and perhaps even, as Charles mentions, adopts a bit of a warmer relation between Beijing and Washington, DC and Brussels, then we could be looking at a world in 2023 with stronger growth, less inflation, and a bit more of a positive tone to this conversation when hopefully we get back together on Stephanomics at the end of the year.
Well, that is a very fine thing to hope for. Now, the other tradition is I lower the tone with my wildcard. Last year I had a sporting prediction that England would win the Football World Cup and everyone would judge Qatar's the best World Cup ever. It didn't quite work out that way, but it was a pretty good final, I would say, and maybe a better World Cup than many thought. I'm going to try my luck and make the same prediction this year, that England are going to win the Football World Cup, but I think I have a much better chance of being right this time because it's the women who'll be playing at the finals next summer in Australia. Thanks for listening to Stephanomics. We'll be back next week, next year. In the meantime, you can find us on the Bloomberg Terminal website, app, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please do rate and review our show so it can reach more listeners. You can also get news and analysis from Bloomberg Economics all the time by following @Economics on Twitter. This episode, as ever, was produced by Magnus Henriksson, Summer Sadi, and Yang Yang, with special thanks to Francine Lacqua, Charles Grant, Peggy Collins, and Tom Orlik. Mike Sasso is our executive producer. Thank you to all of you, and a very happy new year.